today, what we're doing, the process is in the first session of the 2-year term, we try and spend the first part of the session educating ourselves, meeting our agency heads, having them describe their divisions underneath them, and letting us know essentially how we can reach them or the different staff members. And so it's an educational process for us. And today we have the EPD director, Alan Barnes, and I told Director Barnes, I said, you know, we never gave you a honeymoon. He came in the second year of a 2-year term, and we were in the midst of all of our bills, so that seat was awfully hot, awfully fast, and we just welcome Director Barnes. And so if you will just take what time you need, describe to us your agency, and we'll get to questions later, and just turn it over to you.
Questions? You told me there wouldn't be any questions.
We'll adjourn, and then you can have questions.
Okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. Have been here, I guess, I don't know, 16, 17, 18 months. Feels like that many years. As you know, there are no controversial issues with EPD in this agency. So, but we do appreciate your support, and welcome the opportunity to give you a general overview of what EPD does in general, because I think some people really don't understand how we fit really within the Federalist system, quite frankly. So let me start with the mantra that I always give, and that is something that I truly believe in, and I think EPD is where it happens, and that is where we must have a sustainable economy and a sustainable environment. And I think we all would agree with that. And really where that happens, and what makes, I think, my job so exciting, is it happens within this agency, within EPD. EPD, most of you probably already know, not only has a responsibility for protecting the environment, but we also have the responsibility of issuing some almost 45,000 permits for the state of Georgia, and monitoring those and staying on top of those from time to time. So how does that come to be? Well, really, most of the environmental laws, or the majority of the large bulk that we deal with, are federal environmental laws that are then delegated to the states. The states have to sign up to receive that delegation, and there's two responsibilities to do that. And that is that the state has to ensure that there's adequate funding for those programs, and as you all know, we're all struggling with resources, and we know that. And then there's also a responsibility that those federal environmental laws have to be then implemented in a timely and appropriate manner. And that really is the two-pronged test that the federal government looks at to see if a state can maintain that federal delegation of these federal environmental laws. And a lot of people don't realize that I get questions almost every day. Well, we don't like that particular provision of the law. We want to change it. Well, you can't pick and choose in that federal delegation. Once you take the delegation of a particular program, then you have a responsibility to then implement those federal environmental laws. If you pick and choose, then the federal government can, at that point, withdraw that delegation, and then the citizens of the state of Georgia would basically be having to go down the street to the federal government to be asking to see if they could ever get a permit for a particular activity or action. And all of the states across the nation have decided that they do not want that, and obviously Georgia was, quite frankly, one of the first to accept and to retain and to get those delegations, because they want Georgia citizens dealing with a Georgia agency, not with the federal government, in both protecting their environment and in receiving their permits for a sustainable economy. So with that context, I think a lot of people don't realize that we have a delegated authority from the federal government, and the federal government retains that oversight responsibility on those federal environmental laws. So how are we structured? Really three areas: air, land, and waste. And basically that pretty well describes it. We have obviously our air division primarily dealing with air quality, land dealing primarily with disposable how are we disposing of waste in the state of Georgia, including landfills. I remember when I first took this job, they wanted me to go to Washington and meet the delegation, and they wanted to give me all these issues that they wanted people to me to be aware of, and I said, tell me about landfills, because I can tell you that most of the questions are going to come about different landfills or issues with waste disposal, and it's just really because of people. We want these things, but we just don't want them in our backyard, and that really is what it boils down to. Well, it has to be somewhere, and so what we're doing is balancing that interest as we evaluate these permits. So we have like I say, air, land, and water division. Years ago, quite frankly, the land division that deals with waste was probably one of the most controversial, dealing with Superfund sites and landfills and disposal of waste. And I think we've pretty well weathered that storm across the nation. There's still some issues there, and there will remain some. But the air and certainly water, as you recognize in this state, are the two areas where we have the most controversy, and we have certainly the most action. Because part of our responsibility also is to propose rules and regulations for the state of Georgia to implement these laws, and we've done that. We've done that, and I'll say it up front before I get to questions later. We've done that with interbasin transfers. We had that rule that went before the DNR board last month, and it was passed unanimously. The criteria that this body had within the state water plan, the exact language that was in that state water plan was proposed and was passed by our DNR board. And so that is a responsibility that we have. A controversial one that came about by the federal government we had the previous month was dealing with greenhouse gas, and that was one of those situations where a lot of people said, we don't want to have that regulation in the state of Georgia, and we had to remind them that, yes, but you want the delegation of that air program within the state, and this is a part of it. And to their credit, they stepped up and they passed the rules and regulations that were required for Georgia to regulate the greenhouse gases in a manner consistent with the federal government's rules and regulations. So we have about 800 and something employees that are, I'm proud to say, are very hard-working folks. I will match them against any agency in the state, and quite frankly against any agency in the nation. I've been very impressed with their work ethic and their quality of work, their commitment to their work. As I told the Appropriations Committee the other day, is most of the time I don't get complaints about our group not doing the work. The complaints I get is that our folks are doing too much work and too good a work. So that's a good situation, quite frankly, to be in from my perspective. But let me kind of walk you through some of the issues that we have. Like I mentioned, we also process 40-something thousand, almost 45,000, or have out there permits. Well, you're not just sitting there issuing a permit. These permits today, in today's environment, so they protect the environment, are highly complex. So it takes a lot of analysis. It takes a lot of modeling to take place, particularly with these air permits and the water permits, so you can be sure that you're actually being able to balance the impacts that it could have to the environment, as well as being able to sustain the economy. So, you know, the old days of filling out a form and getting a permit, those are pretty much over with. These are complex permits for the most part, and a lot of modeling takes place, a lot of analysis takes place, a lot of input takes place from a variety of different people. We try to let them have their voice to be heard, and obviously anytime before we have a rule, we have a notice and comment period and respond to those. So the permitting aspect is certainly a part of what we do really for the economy, but we're also out there protecting, as we should be, protecting the environment to ensure that we have clean air. And the air is a whole lot cleaner in Georgia and in the entire country because of these environmental regulations. The water is considerably cleaner than it has been in probably the last 50 years in the United States and in Georgia. But do we still have a lot of work to do? Yes, we do. And each time we reach one of these standards, it seems that then we ask ourselves to move to the next step and to do a little bit better, and we'll continue to do that. One of the issues that I really want to focus on during my tenure with EPD is water quantity, and you've heard the governor's talk on that and how we're going to move forward with a task force and a variety of efforts, and I applaud that. And I think that is exactly where we need to move for the state of Georgia. But also want to remember water quality. We have some impaired streams, obviously, in the state of Georgia, and to me, that's unacceptable, and we need to continue to work on water quality issues so that our streams are clean and clear for, quite frankly, for our children to be able to swim in at any time in any stream. That's our ultimate goal. A lot of the impairment is historical artifacts of issues that we didn't even realize what we were doing in some of these streams, and it'll take many, many years to clean those up. But a primary concern is sediment, and we need to do a better job of ensuring that sediment does not enter our streams, and we need to ensure that everyone, including other state agencies, don't impair those streams and those water bodies as well. These laws apply across the board. They apply to everyone, as they should. They've given me all types of things I'm supposed to tell you folks, but I'm really not too good at going through all of those. I'd really like to open it up to your questions. It's been my experience that most of the time people like to talk about what they want to talk about, not what I want to talk about. So I've given you kind of a general overview, and I think most of you already know it, about what our agency does. It's primarily, from an environmental protection standpoint, it's exactly that. It's real simple. That's the way I try to keep it. We try to ensure that we have clean air, clean water, and that we protect our land and our resources. And our folks are about doing that every single day. They need more of them to do it, but you already know that already, and we won't get into those issues. With that, Madam Chair, I'll just open it up to questions.
Thank you. The board's already lit up with questions, but before we get to the questions, I've had some committee members ask if there are contact people that they can reach for the different divisions. So if y'all could get us a list of just contact people, and we can get that information to the committee, because as the session goes on, you know, they might have a question from a constituent or an issue that they need to get to someone and talk to. And you're at all of our meetings, so you're available. And I want the new members in particular to know that. But if we will just try and keep our questions to one subject briefly to give other members a chance to ask their questions. We'll begin with Representative Long.
How you doing, Commissioner? I don't have a question. I just have a statement for this body and this committee right here. When I first met the Commissioner, everyone on, I guess, in the General Assembly knows about pentachlorophenol now because of me hitting that issue really hard. And I was able to call the EPD up under his leadership. He was extremely accessible. I think within a couple of days or maybe a week or so of him taking on the assignment, he met me for lunch and went out and toured my district. And I don't know if you guys know about my district, but I've got some really challenging issues down there that I don't know what my predecessor, I'm not going to speak ill of him, but I can tell you, if you were a company wanting to do ill will in regards to the environment, you had a long time to do it. You had a huge playground to do that in over a course of 30-something years. And this commissioner has basically allowed me, with his accessibility, to actually clean up a very challenging area. I've had apartment complex owners who actually, between challenging areas where this particular fella is an orchard, an oasis in the middle of despair between Stanton and DeLoe Drive in my district, where I've had 6 murders in one apartment complex called Allison Court between September and now. And this guy is the only touchstone basis that I have between those streets. And he couldn't refinance his property because of a hardship being sanctioned on him with having abandoned dry cleaners across the street. And he had been trying to get access to the EPD, the commissioner, for over a year and spent maybe around $15,000 of litigation trying to go through this process. And Commissioner Allen was accessible for my landowner there and allowed him, basically, we wrote a letter, with HUD letter to HUD, and that particular landowner, who I rely on a whole lot to combat crime in my district, was able to refinance his apartment complex with over 1,500 units and to stay in my district. And that kind of valuable service right there, I only want to come on the microphone and give credit when it counts. I know I haven't told you that, but that means a lot to a state representative whose district was hungry for new leadership and actually hungry to change the way things look. And I want to tell you, I appreciate that in front of all my committee members here. Thank you so much.
Well, we appreciate that. I understand with this one, we're always glad to hear good news because you're always one decision away from hearing the opposite of that. So it's nice to receive.
We all, and as members of this committee, we all know and understand our issues are not simple issues. They're very complex. And it's another reason we try and do our homework early on. So the next number I had is number 19. So identify yourself and then ask your question.
Yeah, I'm Bob Hanner. Director, let me ask you something. You may not know this off the top of your head, but number one, how many counties in the state have more than one basin?
108.
108?
Would you think about that for a minute?
Well, okay. Now, how many interbasin transfers do we have in effect now?
That one I'll have to get back to you with. It's probably somewhere around 26, something in that range.
Okay. But 108 counties have more than one basin in the boundaries. That's
108 counties reside in at least 2 or more basins.
okay.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, number 16, just identify yourself.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Brian Thomas. Director, you're familiar, I'm sure, with Supreme Court decisions about wetlands that have happened over the last number of years, Swank and Rapanos, that have kind of limited the Corps' jurisdiction over certain defined wetlands, isolated wetlands, and there's some concerns that those cases will limit the Corps' ability to do any 404 permitting on headwaters, streams. Given your concerns with water quality, and given that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is the lead agency in terms of permitting impacts to streams and water bodies in the state, and we don't really have any kind of parallel program here, are there any things that we can do in the state that can ensure that we're at least trying to protect some of those headwater streams when we know those headwaters are feeding streams that we have particular interest in, like impaired streams, trout streams, and so forth, that can happen outside of the 404 Corps permitting regime?
Well, anytime before you get a 404 permit, you have to, the predicate for that is to get a 401 water quality permit from the state. So we have that particular permit and exercise. I think the question you're asking is, or at least I'm going to assume, and you correct me, is that as the courts have restricted the definition really of U.S. waters, does that leave some areas unprotected? And the answer to that is obviously it doesn't have the additional federal protection, but if they're state waters, it still has the protection that we have within our laws of state waters. The other thing that I have initiated is that we received about $750,000 grant for to basically create a wetlands program within the state of Georgia and to be able to look at some of those issues, primarily directly related to the fact that there's a lot of controversy, as you well know, with those cases as the federal government and the Corps are trying to determine. There is no bright line test anymore, and so what's in and what's out, that really is not good for the environment, and it's not fair to the regulated community either. So we're very pleased to get that grant through EPA, and we will continue to move forward with that as we look at protecting the state's wetlands.
Thank you. With the point of contact information you're going to provide to the committee, could you mention who is responsible for overseeing that grant and that program, just in case I have some questions on that?
Sure. It'll be our water branch director, but as I tell the folks, ultimately, if they're doing a good job, it's their credit. If it's a bad job, then call me. That blame will be mine.
Thanks.
Thank you. And then number 15.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Debbie Buckner. Hi, Director Barnes.
Good morning.
I'm not going to ask you about interbasin transfers.
Well, I appreciate that.
I appreciate the fact that the board did put the rules in place. I know there's been controversy about should and shall, but what I want to talk to you about is about water, however. Several of us have been very interested and concerned about what's going to happen with Judge Mangelson's ruling. And several of us have talked to the governor and have talked to our federal officials about the potential of increasing the dam height of Buford Dam at Lake Lanier and potentially doing some dredging in Lake Lanier to make sure that there is more capacity. And by doing that, when we get authorization to do those studies, that construction, that we might be able to also get authorization for that to be used as drinking water for Atlanta. My question to you is, do you have, since you mentioned sedimentation, do you have any indication of how much Lake Lanier may have had in the way of infill from all the years of use? And I want to ask two questions. If a study of that type were to be done, do you have any idea if that's something that only the Corps could do and what that cost might be, or is that something that EPD could do?
Well, I'll answer the second one first. It would probably be within the Corps' purview. Obviously, it's a federal regulated facility, and we would have to work with the Corps. The good news is, one of the things that I've also done, and to the Corps' credit, they were responsive. We've reached out to the Corps, to the General here in the Southeast Atlantic Division, who's been very cordial, and to the two colonels in both Savannah and Mobile that impact Georgia. And we've had wonderful meetings with them, and we're identifying projects in the state that we can work together on. Obviously, we have disagreements with the Corps on some issues, and we will continue to have those. I mean, that's just the way this does business, but we don't need that to stop all business. And so I'm pleased with the relationship that we have with them on the issues. We agree to disagree on some of the other things, and those will work themselves out as they work themselves out. So I can certainly have that type of conversation with the Corps, and we'll be glad to do so. I am not aware of the amount, or if there has been a study. There may be, and I can have our folks look at it and report back to you if one exists, and perhaps get with the Corps to see. I'm sure it won't be the first time they've had that type of study somewhere else. What would be the approximate cost and time frame?
Thank you. Right now, I see no questions, but I know there are going to be a couple more to pop up. At one point,
we can leave now. Then
I know. I get to. At one point, we had, I guess, the presentation of some of the parts of our state that are going to be brought under the Air Quality Control Act, and it expanded, not just the metropolitan Atlanta area, but it expanded to around our state. And it's my understanding that it was being looked at further by the EPA, and so it's, in a way, it's just been tabled. But there is, I think it's an issue that our committee needs to be aware of, that at some point you might think it's just Atlanta that's in the non-attainment zone, but when I looked at the map, it is all around the state, and it really is where our larger cities are or where our interstates are. So if you could just, I don't want to put you on the spot with that, but I know that we've had to identify certain areas because there are certain trigger points that make you identify those areas. And if you could explain that, because at some point it's going to be a hot issue before our committee.
Right, and I'll be glad to get back and get some information to you and to the members of the committee. What you're talking about is the air quality standards, and as EPA and the federal government sets those standards, and they also then designate an area that's either in attainment or, unfortunately, some areas are in non-attainment. And I can tell you from my days over at EPA, my issue with that when I was with EPA, and quite frankly, many within EPA understand it. Sometimes an area is deemed in non-attainment, and there's nothing they can do about it, and there's nothing they did to cause it. But they're the particular area that receives the burden of trying to move forward. And I hope EPA is working on some of those issues. You are correct in that there are a number of standards, air quality standards, that EPA has in the works. And depending on where they land with those standards, then that would then place different parts of the state in a non-attainment, or could in a non-attainment status. Obviously, we're commenting on all those issues and what those standards should be, but I will keep you apprised of that. And we're hopeful that they will arrive at a reasonable standard.
We're hopeful too. I can tell you just from my experience as a county and that eventually was in the metropolitan Atlanta statistical area, we ended up being in non-attainment, and it it was not an abstract academic word after a while. It was, you cannot build a road, a new road.
Correct.
You can improve your intersection, you can't do a new road. Oh, that industry you're looking at, I'm sorry, it has this so much, and you cannot have this industry come to your area. So it translates into what I think you said your mission was, to have a sustained economy and a sustained environment. So it is an issue that eventually will be before our committee, and I think Parrott, Georgia is the only one exempt from it, probably, and the rest of the state will get a fast lesson in what that means. So, when we get close to that, if we could, that would be another thing that we could do as a committee, is just sit down, try and grasp and understand what is happening. So I do have.
And the difficulty there, though, because I don't want anyone to go away with thinking that, I mean, the states suggest we obviously try to define and limit where those areas should be, but as in the previous decisions, those decisions are made at the federal level as to who's in and who's out, and it's not a very pleasant exercise for a state, and it does have huge ramifications if you are in non-attainment.
It's been a quiet issue because water has dominated our debate and conversation as a committee, but it is a very serious issue, and so I know we as a committee would want to stay up on that. Will you comment one time for us about the Corps not counting when we return to the basins our water? If I understand that correctly, we have a withdrawal mark against our account on water use, so to speak. But when we return water with some formula, we are not getting credit for the return of water. And if you could explain that. Here we are talking about trying to increase the capacity of Lake Lanier, but it might just be an exercise if we don't get something to show that we have returned to the basin when we have our conversations with other states and such as that.
Well, it's a policy or rule that the Corps has, and I'm not sure I understand it to be able to tell you. We are in discussions with them because it seems illogical that you wouldn't give credit for a return flow, which that should be actually the what you would want a community to do as they use the water and then returning it to a stream. But we'll continue to work with that with the Corps. Like I've stated, as you know, a lot of it is about relationships, and what I'm trying to do is strengthen those relationships with the Corps where we can, and we will do so. And there's some areas like that one that we continue to disagree, and we'll continue to work on them, though. It's been in my experience, though, the more things that you can find that you agree on, the less you find that you disagree on, and so that's my method to my madness, anyway.
Thank you. And we have a question, number 15.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is there's a landfill bill with tire fees in it that's got some questions in my mind, and I wanted to ask you. I live near Upson County, and in Upson County there is a tire mountain. It has been allowed to just pile up there, and I think there was roughly $1.5 million spent to cover it over, and it's very close to the Flint River. I don't understand how it got to be the huge mess that it is, and I was just wondering about EPD's involvement with that particular tire landfill, and if that is just how tire landfills are supposed to be, or is there a different way for us to manage that in this point forward, so that when this bill comes forward, we'll know what we need to either amend or vote for or against.
Well, I don't know the specific facts. I have my deputy here, Jim Mussery, who, as long as Jim stays here, I'll be glad to stay here. If Jim leaves, I'm going to be out the door before him, so I may defer.
Here, we'll turn that mic on, if you'll stand up there, because then we can record it.
Yes, Upson was an illegal tire dump that was not sanctioned by EPD, and we encourage recycling of tires. Unfortunately, there was no way to remove all of those tires and recycle them. So under the Solid Waste Trust Fund, that's being closed and will be monitored, and there'll be restrictions on that property indefinitely. So, rather than the big danger, of course, is with rodents, mosquitoes, or fire. If that thing ever caught on fire, it would be almost impossible to put it out. So, and that work is currently ongoing.
And I don't want to miss an opportunity. So part of your question was how could we prevent that? We could prevent that by the Solid Waste Trust Fund continuing, and we will, as we're trying to do, and I understand very difficult issues, but you know, we all understand there are consequences to our decisions and our actions, and you can only do with the resources that you have.
Thank you. And we have time for one last question. Representative Long?
Well, I think you guys are aware that I found about 5,000 tires on one lot right there in my district, and tires are a problem. In what ways, legislatively, have your hands been tied where perhaps there's some tweaking of legislation that can give the EPD more tools to address the tire issue? And of course, funding is always
well, it's primarily funding. We can give you, and I think some of you already have it, but we can easily give you the Solid Waste Trust Fund and the amount of money that has come into the Solid Waste Trust Fund over the years, and then the amount of money that's been appropriated back to EPD to do these particular tasks. I don't know that there needs to be necessarily additional legislation. Part of the issue, as you and I have discussed, is has to be at the local government level of people being able to make us aware when those type events begin to occur so that we can stop it and prevent it. I mean, there are laws on the books to prevent it now, but you have to have resources out there to police that activity, so to speak.
Okay.
Would it be appropriating or earmarking specific funds for tire collection or the return of?
Well, the Solid Waste Trust Fund, it doesn't earmark it. That seems to be a bad word in everywhere these days for some reason.
Not for tires.
But the you know, the fund is created to do exactly what you're asking to do.
Yes, sir.
And unfortunately, because of difficult economic times within the state, a major portion of that money, the majority of that money, has had to be used for other purposes. So when you do that, you have reduced services in areas that you thought you were paying for.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I do see two more questions, so let's do this. I'll call on you, but make your question brief, and then we'll adjourn. The first one I see is number one. Just say your name and then ask your question.
Carol Fullerton. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I was at part of the Board of Natural Resources meeting the other day, and as you know, there were some articles that came out that about what the board was made aware of and what they weren't made aware of, and I wondered if you could clear that up for me.
Be glad to. I'm glad you asked. That protocol was established with input from everyone, including environmental communities, everyone years ago, as how EPD would process through and provide information to the board of letters as they came in. And quite frankly, and I'll be very blunt about it, the only way a reporter would have known that an individual letter would not be received by the board is if someone tried to set that up to get the story that they wanted. And that's exactly what happened there, because there was no way that anyone would know you don't get individual letters unless you knew that and you were part of that protocol. So I'll be very blunt about that. That letter from the state of Alabama and the Fish and Wildlife Service that they wanted to complain about was no different in subject matter-wise than the other letters that we have that the board was made aware of. The board is not made aware of because of the protocols that were established of John Doe or Jane Smith sent in this letter. They're categorized by subject matter, and it was done appropriately, and it was done with full disclosure.
Okay, thank you. And we'll have a chance for questions afterwards, too. Number 16.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to alert the director and our members that hopefully we will have an opportunity to vote on the ability to dedicate those funds for the Solid Waste Trust Fund so that that money actually goes where we're telling folks we're sending it. That would be House Resolution 112.
Thank you. I see no more questions, but I wanted to allow us some time to ask you questions for our next meeting. So what I'll do is just remind the committee, look at the bulletin boards. That's where we post our information. Check your emails, and we'll adjourn. And Director Barnes, if you'll just hang around a little bit for individual questions, we'd appreciate that too. And thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.